it now. Okay, so welcome to day 2 of the Virtual Wellbeing Festival 2023. Lovely to have you all here with us this afternoon. Just to very briefly introduce myself and my colleagues, well, this session we're going to be talking about financial anxiety. So the session will start shortly. Now, it does say that your cameras and mics are disabled at this time. It's just your mics that are disabled, just to stop any background noise. It would be great if you could keep your cameras on, if possible, just so that it's better for Yasmin to be able to interact with everybody. And as I say, just to introduce myself, I'm Dawn. I'm one of the organisational development facilitators at NHFT, and I'm supported today by my colleague Sasha of the same title. Okay. Just to go through a little bit of housekeeping, the session is being recorded today so that our colleagues can watch back on demand whenever they're available to. As I say, your mics have been disabled, but you will get an opportunity a little bit later on through the session to ask a question. If you would like to ask your question in person, you can just raise your hand. Failing that, you can pop all of your questions into the chat box and Sasha will ask them on your behalf at the right point, really, when questions are due. If anybody is hard of hearing, there is the transcript option. By clicking the 3 dots at the top of the screen, you're able to do that. And just to introduce Yasmin, who is going to talk to us about financial, well, or those worries that we all have from a financial perspective. So Yasmin is a senior psychological wellbeing practitioner, and I'm delighted to introduce you and hand you over now. Thanks, Yasmin.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dawn. So I'm just going to try and share the presentation slides briefly. Just bear with me 1 second. Lovely. Great. Can everyone see that?
We can indeed.
Yeah, lovely. I can only see one person at a time now. So yeah, thanks for letting me know, Dawn. That's brilliant. But yeah, thank you so much for coming in, everyone. As Dawn said, it will be the session on financial anxiety or stress today. So we're going to have an hour's session, have a bit of an introduction, I suppose, to financial anxiety, what that might look like, and hopefully some ways that we can. Hopefully what we'll be running through is a little bit of an introduction to our service and how we might be able to help with some of these anxiety symptoms. So just initially to tell you a little bit about kind of where I'm from. So we are NHS Talking Therapies. So a lot of you may know us as IAPT before. So we have had a name change recently. So it does get a little bit confusing. But we are a service for mild to moderate mental health difficulties. So that could be things like anxiety, stress or depression. And we mainly offer a treatment called cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT for short, which we'll be talking a lot more about in the session today and how that can help. We tend to offer treatment in quite a few different ways. So we've got online CBT, we've got webinars such as this one, we've got groups, and we've got one-to-one support. So, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end about our service, and if you do feel like it will be helpful, how to access it. So I guess in terms of the session today, so just to set a little bit of an agenda so you guys know what to expect. So we're going to cover a little bit about financial stress, as I'm sure, I hope that you're all expecting that this afternoon. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about cognitive behavioural therapy. So that is CBT for short, and how that can help us with these symptoms of stress. And there's a few different things I'd like to cover within that. So I'd like to look at managing our thoughts. So for example, worries or negative thoughts, managing our behaviour when we're stressed, and also looking at the physical symptoms of stress and how we might be able to reduce that a little bit as well. So it is quite a lot to cover. So it's, I think, quite important to note that it's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour with some of these techniques. There will be the opportunity to ask questions, as Dawn mentioned. But if you do feel like you need some further support with these techniques, you can always reach out to our service directly, either just for a general chat or to consider a referral and have an assessment through our service. So it will, like I say, just be a bit of a brief introduction today, and hopefully give you some things to take away and have a little bit of a go with. Because I guess in terms of the session today, we won't necessarily be going through kind of practical tips in terms of, finances and things like that, because I think it's important that we look at how to manage the anxiety and stress around it, because, you know, with everything that's going on recently with the cost of living crisis, we could be doing all of the right things and still be struggling, you know, with the worries and the anxiety and the stress around finances. So I thought it might be helpful for us to run through a few techniques that can hopefully help you guys to manage that. So I guess just initially to touch on with financial anxiety and stress, like I mentioned already, a lot of us are probably feeling this in some way, and there's lots of different causes. There's a few on the slide there that you might be able to see. I think we can all agree that we've seen an increase in a lot of different things across the board. So I guess with financial stress, it's any kind of anxiety or stress that we're feeling as a result of our finances. So it could be, you know, that we're struggling with budgeting. It could be that we've got loans to pay back. It could be kind of, like it mentions on the slide there, kind of job security, things like that. But hopefully, regardless of where the financial stress is coming from for you guys, some of these techniques will be able to help you to manage that a little bit better. And just a little bit of a slide here on the cost of living. There's just a few stats on here. I think some of them are a little bit older than others, but it's just to highlight really how some things really have just increased in price. So there's one there on the food shopping, how much that has gone up. I know I've noticed that in my weekly shop, but also things like transportation, petrol prices. You know, we're seeing all of these things creep up at the moment. So it's no wonder really that with all of that going on, we might start to feel more anxious, stressed, low, you know, potentially feeling really overwhelmed with everything that we need to pay for, you know, or maybe not having the funds to do some of the things that we normally do. So hopefully today we can cover a little bit of a variety of techniques that can help with some of the stress or low mood. So, like I mentioned already, the main type of treatment that we tend to focus on within our service, it's called cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT for short. So it is a talking therapy, but it mainly focuses on practical tips or techniques that can help you with day-to-day symptoms, you know, of things like stress, anxiety or depression. So it differs a little bit from something like counselling, for example, where you might just speak a little bit more openly and kind of, I guess, just a bit more about anything that you bring to the session. Whereas I think CBT can be a bit more structured and look at specific ways that we can actually help going forward. So focusing a bit more on the here and now, I would say, with the CBT. And on the slide there, it's got a little bit of an example of what we tend to look at. So we will look at this in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but we tend to look at a few different areas of our symptoms of stress within CBT. So like I mentioned, we're going to have a bit of a think about the thoughts. We've got the physical feelings, and we've got our behaviours as well, and how they can all interlink together to create a bit of a vicious cycle, really, that we can get ourselves into when it comes to anxiety or stress. So I've just got a little bit of an example here, trying to link it, I suppose, a little bit more with financial worries and things like that. But just so you can see it in a bit of a working example on the slide here, just before we do get started with, you know, how we can actually break the cycle. So just got a situation here, thinking a little bit about, you know, what could be triggering a particular you know, situation, or what's bringing on the stress. So in this situation, it's getting an unexpected bill through the post. So you might notice in that particular situation that you're getting some thoughts. So it might be worries about, are you going to be able to afford it, and feeling quite negative about it in general. So that's going to then impact your emotions and feelings, like it says on the right there. So feeling quite hopeless, sad, maybe anxious about things. And then as a result, we see a change in our behaviour as well. So you might avoid certain things. You might end up snapping at a loved one. I'm sure we've all been there when we're feeling quite stressed and on edge. But often we can behave in a certain way that then increases our anxiety or our low mood. So we then might start to feel quite, you know, upset or on edge that we have done that, you know, that we've snapped at someone, for example, which then brings us back around to worrying again, if that makes sense. So I suppose what we tend to look at within CBT, this is quite a simple example, but it's thinking about how these 3 or 4 areas, I guess you could say, are interlinking to create a bit of a cycle. So often there's things that we're doing within that might be maintaining that, if that makes sense. So like I mentioned, what we'll do for the session today is look at a few different areas of this cycle and a few different techniques that we might be able to apply that are hopefully a little bit more helpful and can help us to break out of that. Because like I mentioned already, there's probably you know, for a lot of us, we might be doing all the right things in terms of our finances. We might be doing things like budgeting, you know, cutting back on things, but that stress, that anxiety, that worry, it might still be there. So I suppose it's just thinking about how can we manage that so it doesn't take over and, you know, get us stuck in this cycle of anxiety. So just to, I guess, initially think about where CBT comes in. Like I've mentioned, it helps us to break that cycle. So we're looking at trying to create some healthy coping mechanisms here, really, and just give you guys some practical things to do to help manage your stress better. So the first area I wanted to look at you guys with, which I think is quite a good one, and I think quite relevant for a lot of people, to be honest, it's thinking a little bit about how CBT can help with managing our thoughts. Because I've mentioned already, you know, we might be having a lot of worries, a lot of negative thoughts about what's going on right now with, you know, the cost of living, maybe our own personal finance situation, worrying about the future, just feeling quite negative in general about that, you know, side of things. So we do look at something within CBT called worry management. So it's thinking about how can we actually manage this worry. So it's quite normal to worry. You know, we all do it. It often just means that we care about something, but often it can become quite uncontrollable, or it can take up quite a lot of our time. It starts impacting us. You know, I'm sure we've all been there where, you know, we're trying to spend time with family or watch a film, for example, but we're thinking about tomorrow or thinking about something in particular, you know, just spending that time worrying, or maybe up at night, can't get to sleep. It's that kind of worry, I suppose, that we're looking at with these techniques. How can we actually try to manage that a little bit? So we're not trying to get rid of the worry altogether. It's quite normal, but just how can we try to condense that and, you know, manage it a little bit better? So we tend to look at two different types of worry within CBT. So we've got the more practical worries. So these ones, I suppose, are the things that we can actually do something about. Usually they're the ones I would say that end up on your to-do list. Often that doesn't always mean we get to them and do them straight away. We might still avoid them or feel overwhelmed by them, but they would usually be things that we can actually action and do something about. So the example on the slide there is needing to pay an overdue bill. I guess other examples could be, you know, booking the car in for a service. It could be buying someone a present when their birthday's coming up. So something that I suppose we can do something about with those ones. On the flip side, we've got the hypothetical worries. So those ones are usually the ones that I would say would start with what if. And they can be about a variety of different things. They don't just have to be about finances. Obviously, it could be literally anything. But I suppose with the hypothetical worries, usually the way I describe them is that there's not usually anything we can do about them in the moment. So it might be worrying about, you know, what's going to happen next month, next week. What if we can't afford things? You know, what if things don't get any better, like it says there? And often these worries can be quite difficult to manage just because they do tend to be, well, you know, they tend to be quite uncontrollable, I suppose, and tend to spiral. So, you know, when we kind of think of that worst case scenario, what if this happens? What if that happens? And they can take up a lot of time as well when we're thinking that way. So I suppose in terms of our worries, these are the main two types that we tend to look at. Obviously, certain situations might bring on a bit of a mixture of both of these worries. It's quite normal to have both. You know, quite a clear example might be, for example, if I need to book my car in for an MOT, that in itself, I suppose, is a practical worry because I can do something about that. I can ring the garage and get it booked in. But then there might be some hypothetical worries that almost get in the way of that. So it might be things like, what if I get overcharged? What if it costs a lot and I can't afford it? What if the garage can't fit me in before the due date? Things like that. So it's quite normal to have both. And for some of us, it might be that we struggle with one more than the other, but there are a couple of different techniques that we can look at within CBT to help us manage these types of worries. So just to, I guess, a helpful tip, if you're not really sure, you know, what types of worries are coming up for you, you know, what ones are coming up more than others, it can be really helpful just to keep a little bit of a log of them before you get started with actually trying to manage them. It can just be really helpful in general as a bit of a reflection, you know, something to do to help you reflect on the types of worries that you are having. But also helpful, like I say, to actually see which ones are coming up more often and which ones you think you might need to focus on a little bit more. So I guess in terms of the practical worries, we can do something here called problem solving. So problem solving, I would say it's something that a lot of us do naturally anyway in certain situations, especially at work. I think a lot of us probably do use this type of technique, but we don't always think about applying it to our own worries, if that makes sense, guys. So it's about trying to figure out the best possible solution. So I suppose with these ones, it would be more the worries that you're not sure what to do about. So maybe there's more than one, possible solution to your worry. You're not sure what to do. For example, you're not sure if you can afford, to go out for dinner, or can't afford to go for a holiday this year. Just trying to figure out what the solution might be, I suppose. But it gives a bit more structure to that process. So it looks at kind of identifying the worry that you do want to focus on, and then trying to convert that into a practical problem. So say, for example, I do need to get some work done on my car, but I'm not sure whether to go with the garage that I've, had it looked at, or if I need to, get some different quotes. So it's about identifying what the different solutions actually are. So I'd write all of the solutions out, whatever I can think of, even silly things. Sometimes it can just help to get it all on paper. And then you want to look at strengths and weaknesses of each solution. So that's what I mean when I say a lot of us probably do this type of thinking, in our workplace or in different elements of our lives, but we don't always apply it to our personal worries. So looking at different strengths of solutions, and then selecting a solution and trying to make a bit of an action plan going forward with how we can manage this. So it might be that, I write out all of the different garages, for example, and make a plan to ring them for quotes, and then choose the best one and try to put that plan into action. I think a helpful step that it does add is the reviewing of the plan. So how did that actually go? Was it helpful? Just taking that time for a reflection at the end, I suppose, as well. And it doesn't have to mean that the solution you pick is the end solution either. It might be that, try one thing, it doesn't work, but then you've got that list to go back on and try something else. So it just gives you a little bit more of a structured approach, I suppose, to managing these practical worries, because I'm sure, I don't mind admitting this, I'm sure we all do it. I've got quite a few things on my to-do list that potentially I could use this for, but I've just been putting them off. And that's what often makes them feel quite overwhelming, is that avoidance, I suppose, with the practical worries. And like I mentioned, that can then bring on some hypothetical worry as well. So usually this is what we'd recommend for those more practical worries, is trying to go through this process to see if you can get a little bit of a plan in place for them. I suppose with the hypothetical worries, like I say, these ones are often the ones that people can struggle with quite a lot in terms of them spiraling, and kind of feeling quite bad and causing that anxiety and that stress for us. So we can use something called worry time in these situations. So I don't know if any of you have come across this before, but essentially it's the idea that we're trying to condense how much time we're spending worrying. So it can feel a little bit unnatural at first, I think, when we explain this to people. But it looks at how can we actually, reduce the amount of time we're spending worrying, and also just trying to get a little bit of control back over these worries, because we might be going through the day, going to work, taking the kids to school, walking the dog, whatever it might be, noticing these worries coming through at any given time, really, and they can just take over and ruin our day, essentially, or distract us from what we need to do. So the idea with the worry time is that we're trying to condense them into a specific block of time in the day. Usually we'd recommend about 20 minutes. And I guess the key step with this is to be writing down the worries when they do come up, so you can take them to that worry time. And it's just about trying to be quite boundaried with yourself. It can be quite a difficult technique to master, because it's difficult to let go of the worries in the moment. But if you are able to get this working for you, often people do notice, one, a reduction in their worries, and two, they also just find the worries that come up a lot less distressing in general. So I suppose, like I say, the first step there is to plan your worry time in. So what time do you actually want to sit down and do this worrying? Writing the worries down as they come up, so you can revisit them if you need to in that worry time. Trying to refocus on the present moment. So for example, you notice a worry come up while you're working, you'd want to note that down if you can, and then try to get on with whatever task you were doing before. Trying to tell yourself that you'll come back to that worry a little bit later in the day, which, like I say, requires a little bit of practice. And then when you do get to your worry time, you can, spend a little bit of time going through your list. But it's important to note, I suppose, that it's not necessarily about trying to solve these worries, because as I've already touched on, they're often unsolvable, to be honest. And we can spend lots and lots of times going round and round with these ones and not necessarily get anywhere. But I suppose the aim with the worry time is just to give them that time and space that they're clearly, demanding from you, but, in a way that's in your control. So, if you choose, for example, to worry at 6 p.m. each night before dinner, sit down, timer for 20 minutes, go through your worries, allow yourself to think about them, and then try to kind of reset for the next day as well. And I think it's quite important to note with this technique as well, it doesn't necessarily mean the worries won't come back. It may be actually that you get similar worries every day. But it's just about trying to be consistent, and hopefully over time it does reduce kind of how, I guess, anxiety provoking some of these worries can be. So those are the two main techniques we would look at for the worry management. So like I mentioned at the beginning, it is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I am aware of that. So if you do feel like you need more support with any of these techniques, you can always kind of get in touch with our service or consider getting some support with us, where we do go through these things in more detail. But usually we would say, you know, trying to keep a bit of a diary and then see what comes up for you in terms of practical and hypothetical worrying, and then trying to implement some of these techniques as well. So there are a few tips on the slide there. Just like I mentioned, trying to keep to a maximum of 20 minutes, not using worry time in bed, because I'm sure a lot of us do enough worrying before going to sleep as it is. We don't really want to be increasing that. You know, trying to plan in something relaxing or distracting after you finish your worry time, just to kind of get your mind off those worries, help reset yourself and be able to get on with whatever you want to do. And yeah, just trying to be consistent and practicing the skill, because, you know, with a lot of CBT techniques, they do take a little bit of time and a bit of, you know, trying to persist through kind of any initial teething issues that you may have with it. So I guess that's kind of mainly what we would look at for thoughts when we're thinking about worrying. But I did also just want to mention negative thinking. I mean, I won't be going into too much detail with this just you know, in this session, but I suppose it's important to mention, because you might have been thinking that when I was going through the worries, that, you know, sometimes we have thoughts that maybe don't fit into practical or hypothetical worry. They're perhaps just more of a negative thought, really, and it's quite normal to have these as well. But when we're feeling stressed or low, we might have a lot more. So there's lots of different types, as you can see on the slide there, but I just thought it was important to mention them, just so we can, you know, keep an eye on what types of thoughts we are having around our finances, because often they can be quite harsh about ourselves. So, you know, we've got one of the top ones there, labeling. So just thoughts like, I'm a failure, I'm an idiot, why do I bother? We might have a negative mental filter. So, you know, thinking things like, I've already gone over budget, so I might as well write it off. Things like that. All or nothing thinking. So that could be things like, if I can't have a nice holiday, there's no point in going anywhere at all. So, you know, just feeling quite black and white about things. So lots of different negative thoughts that we can have. So it's also, I think, important to be a little bit aware of these types of thoughts that can be coming through for us. And sometimes it can surprise us how many of these we are actually having, because we can, I guess, accept them as facts sometimes if we don't challenge them in the moment. So sometimes it's important to notice these thoughts that are coming through and actually take a step back and reflect and think, is this actually true? You know, is there another way of looking at this, essentially? Because, you know, even just all these thoughts on this slide here, if we're having all of these in a day over a couple of days, I mean, how do you think that impacts our mood? It's definitely going to keep us feeling quite low, you know, potentially quite anxious. It might increase our worry. So it's just important, I suppose, to keep an eye on the types of negative thoughts we might be having. And like I mentioned, not going to go into too much detail with all of these different types today, but if this is something that you feel like you struggle with, it is something that we do offer treatment for within the service as well. So you can always get a little bit more support on this side of things if you feel like you need to. But thought it was, you know, quite important, I suppose, to mention this type of thought as well as the worries, because I know a lot of people will be struggling with these types of thoughts as well at the moment. But I guess that does lead us towards the end of the section on maybe our thoughts, so worries, negative thoughts, how we might begin to recognise them and manage them. I guess it might just be a helpful point to stop and see if any of you guys have any questions around those techniques or anything that you wanted to ask. So you can either, I think you'll be able to kind of unmute yourself, or if you did want to put anything in the chat.
There's there aren't any questions in the chat at the moment.
No worries.
But Dawn has made a comment and said that she likes the idea of worry time. As a born worrier, she likes the idea of that.
Yeah, definitely. It can it either really appeals to people or it really puts them off immediately. So like I say, it can feel quite unnatural at first, but actually if you think about how much time you're spending worrying without the worry time, it's probably more than 20 minutes, to be honest.
Dawn's got her hand up actually.
Oh, yeah.
I'll come with a question. Do you think, because this is one thing that I always think, well, maybe it's a good thing, but I don't know. Is it a good thing to, if you are worrying about things, to keep really busy? Because I think that can be a good and a bad thing sometimes. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, Dawn, because it's something that we do think about within that CBT model in terms of our behaviours, you know, what is actually helpful and what isn't. And I think it depends would be my answer, and it definitely is on a case-by-case basis. But I think it's important to look at, am I doing all of this and am I keeping busy to avoid these worries? Because that avoidance often isn't helpful and it keeps that cycle going, if that makes sense. So yes, keeping yourself busy so you don't think about it for a few days is going to help in the short term, but actually long term those worries are probably still going to be there, if that makes sense. So actually by bringing something like worry time in, you're still giving yourself the chance to look at them and focus on them and give them a bit of time, but in a way that's in your control, if that makes sense. So you're not feeling like you're completely running away from them. Because I think, yeah, it's an important point, because a lot of us, when we get stressed, overwhelmed, we do that, you know, we just want to bury our heads in the sand, basically. And especially with finances, you know, just won't open the bank app or something like that. So it's just, I think it's an important point, because it's thinking about where is this, you know, need to keep busy coming from. So if it is around that avoidance, I'd definitely kind of encourage you to challenge that a little bit, you know, and try and kind of bring that worry time in.
Thank you.
Definitely, no problem. Were there any other questions around these bits, or are we happy to move on? No, I mean, there will be a bit more time at the end as well, guys, if you do think of anything as we're going through. But just let me know, obviously. Lovely. So the next section I wanted to focus on was a bit more around our behaviours. So actually this leads on quite nicely, I think, from what Dawn was saying. So we're going to be thinking a little bit now about how we actually respond when we're feeling stressed or low or anxious, because actually a lot of us, we stop doing the things that we normally do, you know, whether that's things that we enjoy, whether it's things around the house, socialising, whatever it might be. A lot of the time you will see a bit of avoidance when you're feeling that way. And I think it's kind of natural in a way, because, you know, if we're feeling quite low or stressed and we know we've got quite a lot of things to do, we can notice some thoughts like, oh, you know, I can't be bothered. I'll do it tomorrow. I don't need to do that today. You know, and we start to make perhaps choices that we don't usually make if we're feeling a little bit better in ourselves. So, you know, I guess a good example is, you know, we had a rubbish day, you know, we're feeling quite low, maybe a bit anxious, we've been worrying, and, you know, it gets to dinner time, we've got no motivation to cook, we don't want to, we feel like perhaps we deserve not to have to cook because we've had a bad day, and I guess that initial reaction could be, I'll order a takeaway, or, you know, I'll go out and get a bottle of wine or get myself some food, and yeah, that can definitely make us feel better in the short term, but I guess it's all going back to what I was saying with Dawn, is that kind of that long-term impact. You know, what are our thoughts going to be after we've done that? Is that going to make us feel better in the long term, or are we going to notice some negative thoughts? Oh, you know, now I've, you know, spent even more money on the takeaway, or, you know, just worrying that we didn't kind of make a healthy meal or whatever it might be. So we've got those types of behaviours, but we've also got just the general kind of motivation side of things, I think. You know, often when we are feeling quite low or stressed, we're obviously using quite a lot of our energy on this worrying or feeling quite low. So we can notice a bit of a drop in our behaviours and what we might be doing. So what we tend to look at within the behaviour area of the cycle is something called behavioural activation, which is quite simple, but I think it can be a really helpful concept. So it looks at how to get a bit of balance in your days and weeks, because often what we do find, like I say, when you're stressed, you're low, there's something that you're going to stop doing. So for some people, it might be that we stop doing the chores. So maybe we don't do the washing, or, you know, we don't keep up with the dishes, or we don't do the hoovering that we normally do. But for some of us, we might do all of that, but we might just stop doing things that we enjoy, you know, stop actually spending time maybe watching the programs we want to watch or doing our hobbies. Maybe we feel like we don't have time or money to do those things, so we stop doing them. And for some people, it could be a bit of a combination, but usually you will see some kind of drop in what you're doing when, you know, when you're feeling stressed or low. So with behavioural activation, it looks at a bit of how to keep a bit of a balance in our activities, because it's what's been shown is that if we can keep this balance, we will often feel a lot more productive, we'll feel a lot better, and there'll be a lot less avoidance in general as well. So it splits it into 3 main categories that could be really helpful to look at, actually. So you've got routine, so that's the things that you're doing daily. So it could be things like just, you know, getting up, showering, making your breakfast, doing things for the kids, walking the dog, going to work, you know, just your general day-to-day things. Then we've got the necessary ones. So these are the ones I would say are the ones that if you don't do them, there'll be some kind of negative consequence. They overlap a little bit with practical worries, actually, in that it might be things like booking yourself a GP appointment, you know, getting your bills sorted. It might be kind of buying things that you need to buy, doing the food shopping, just anything essentially that you need to get done. And then finally, we've got pleasurable activities. So that could be obviously things that you do for yourself or with other people, could include self-care activities. Obviously, lots of things are going to come under that, and it will be different person to person. But what we want to be trying to do with behavioural activation is getting a balance between those activities. So it can be really helpful sometimes just to actually look at your last week and what you've been doing, especially if you've been feeling really stressed, and seeing where most of your time is going, and if you might have a bit of an imbalance between those 3 areas. Because, you know, we might be doing all of the routine things day to day, but like I said, we might be avoiding lots of necessary tasks like paying a bill, booking appointments, you know, getting things sorted. Or we might be spending a lot of time, you know, keeping busy, going out with friends, doing lots of social things, but perhaps avoiding more routine and necessary things. So it's going to be different person to person, but it's quite a helpful concept to keep in mind. You know, am I having, or do I have a good balance between these 3 areas? And there are a couple of things that you can do to help you, you know, have a look at this for yourself. So the first step is to look at the activities you're actually doing or want to be doing in each of those areas. So you could have a look at routine, necessary and pleasurable activities, and maybe make a bit of a list of the things that you'd like to be doing, you know, day to day, week to week with these areas. It doesn't necessarily have to be things you're doing right now. It could be things that you used to do. It could be a new hobby that you want to pick up. But sometimes it can just be really helpful to actually put into perspective, what do I actually want my weeks to look like? So making that list is actually, I think, quite a good step. And I quite enjoy doing that side of it, actually. And next, you can make a bit of a hierarchy of these activities. So what could be really helpful to increase our motivation and consistency is to actually have a bit of an idea of what level of difficulty these tasks are. So you could also look at which ones feel easy, which ones feel kind of medium difficulty, and which ones feel difficult to motivate yourself to do. And it's quite important to have that, really, because then you can really work your way up to those more difficult tasks if possible. Or if you know that you've got a bit of a busy day, you might plan in some easier tasks. And what I mean by kind of how difficult it is to motivate yourself to do is, I suppose, how much you can get yourself up and going for this particular task. So I'll just give you some brief examples for myself. You know, maybe doing the dishes, I don't personally mind that job. I might put that under easy. Medium might be hoovering, you know, the whole downstairs, and difficult for me would definitely be cleaning the bathroom. So obviously it's going to be different person to person, and that's just one example of like housework, but you can also apply it to, you know, your pleasurable activities and your necessary ones as well. But sometimes it's a helpful thing to do, is just take a bit of a step back and reflect, how difficult are these tasks, which ones do I find more challenging than others, and trying to plan around that, really. You know, rather than having a whole day where you're trying to go through your whole to-do list, would it be more helpful to spread it across the week, for example, and do a few easy activities on the busier days, you know, and kind of plan in those difficult activities so that you are more likely to actually do them. And that is what behavioural activation tends to focus around, is trying to actually make a bit of a plan week to week. So it's not that you need to plan every single minute of every single day, But like I say, it's just about trying to focus on getting that balance between these areas. So it might be that you do need to actually plan in some self-care activities. You know, a lot of us say we want to do certain things for ourselves, or we'd like to do a hobby more, but we don't necessarily think much about, well, when could I put this in? You know, what could I actually, when could I do this? Is there anything I need to get me going with this? So it does just give you that space to take a step back, plan your week, and just try to make sure that you really are getting a bit of a balance in that week. I would say it would also help reduce guilt and rumination, because often, you know, I've definitely been there, hopefully, well, not hopefully, but I'm sure some of you guys have as well, where we'll be doing something for ourselves, maybe watching a film, trying to spend time with family, but in the back of our mind, we're thinking of all the things maybe we should be doing, like the housework or the other bits and bobs, the food shopping. So with this particular technique, I suppose, by planning those things in certain days, you do reduce that guilt, because you know that you've got time set aside, for example, to do that housework, or go and do the food shop when you need to. And I suppose with this one, it's quite a simple technique, like I mentioned, but it's just kind of giving you a little bit more structure to your week, and give you a bit of time and space for reflection, I suppose, in terms of being able to actually plan around what you've already got going on. And you can also, I suppose, bring in planning around kind of finances and things like that. So having to think about what you can afford to be putting in, you know, is there anything that you need to be prioritizing? Could even be that you plan to sit down and make a budget for the month, that kind of thing. So you can kind of incorporate maybe some of these goals that you've got to help you, you know, week to week with managing some of these. So a few tips on the other side there. It's kind of beginning, you know, beginning is the most difficult part, so it's that kind of initial motivation. So definitely kind of setting the smaller goals initially, starting with these easier activities. You know, often we'll start with something easy, get a little bit of boost of productivity, and be able to actually do another task that maybe we didn't even feel like we wanted to do. So starting small, build yourself up gradually. Reviewing as you go, which is, I guess, a key element with the CBT techniques in general, is figuring out what's working well for you and what didn't, and trying to kind of problem solve any issues. I guess with alongside that, you could use the problem solving technique that I mentioned to help you plan a little bit. So, you know, if you know that you need to kind of, you know, I guess book your car in for an MOT, if you need to create a monthly budget, you can use those problem solving steps as well to help you if you're not sure exactly what you need to plan in. And I love that last one, because I think it is really important, and I think a lot of us do forget, but pleasurable activities and self-care are just as important as the routine and necessary ones. Do plan them in if you can. I think a lot of us just assume, oh, later I'll, you know, make time to read my book, or I'll make time to have a bath, but actually it's sometimes the last thing on our list, and it gets replaced by other things like doing the cleaning, or, you know, whatever else demands our attention. So by planning them in, it empowers us a little bit to actually take that time for ourselves, and, you know, makes us feel like we've got a bit more balance in our weeks as well. So like I mentioned, it is a fairly simple technique, but it can be quite a helpful one, I think, especially as we're often avoiding more things than we think when we're stressed, or, you know, if we're low as well, we can avoid a lot of different things. And trying to tackle that avoidance is a really key part of keeping ourselves feeling a little bit better. So it can be quite a helpful technique to use for that, definitely. But I guess in terms of this, you know, this technique, in terms of planning in the activities, maybe trying to tackle that avoidance, did anyone have any questions or thoughts around this one, just before I do move on?
There's nothing in the chat, Yasmin, at the moment.
No problem. Well, hopefully it's making sense. It is a fairly simple one, like I say, but sometimes it is so important to just go back to the basics, you know, when we are stressed, because like I say, there's a lot that we just don't do, or we feel like we don't have time to do. So just taking a little bit of a step back to plan that in and make some time for self-care can be really important. I guess leading on from that, in terms of self-care and, you know, looking after ourselves physically, the final area I just wanted to talk a little bit about today was thinking a bit about relaxation, or actually how to manage the physical symptoms of stress. So I know we hear quite a lot, and I'm sure there's been things, you know, other sessions running this festival around things like exercise, eating, that kind of thing. We hear a lot about those things, and I guess know what we need to do there. But what I wanted to talk a bit more specifically about today were maybe just a few specific relaxation techniques that you guys can use to help manage any physical signs of stress and anxiety, because we can see quite a lot of those come up when we are stressed. So it might be that you're getting more headaches. For some people it's feeling sick, it might be getting palpitations, chest pains, just general body aches and pains can be quite common as well. And I guess with increased worry, we might see issues with our sleep as well. So sometimes just having a few techniques like this can be really helpful to fall back on and actually be able to use. And you could then implement them, and plan them in using that kind of behavioural activation, just trying to make that time for yourself so you can actually use some of these techniques as well. So there's a couple of different things. It does mention exercise on there. I'm sure we all know that is a great thing to do for our mental health, but can be difficult to motivate ourselves to do. Absolutely. I guess it's another one that you could use the behavioural activation to help you plan in. So it might be just really starting gradually with exercise. Is there something that feels a little easier, and find something that perhaps feels fun to you. So it might be starting really, really small, like 5 minutes of running, something like that, and building yourself up. But it's good, to find a way that you can move your body that you enjoy. But I guess what I wanted to talk about were a couple of specific relaxation techniques. So you may have come across a couple of these before. They are talked about, but they can just be quite nice things just to have, I guess, in your toolbox almost, just to fall back on if you are feeling particularly stressed and just want to try something. So this one I quite like. It's called progressive muscle relaxation. So it's a bit more of a relaxation technique. You might have come across it on mindfulness apps, meditation apps sometimes have it as well. But essentially it targets the muscle tension. So I'm sure we all know that when we're feeling quite stressed and anxious, we can feel quite tense quite quickly, and we do tend to hold tension in our body in lots of different places. Actually, you'd often be surprised. So again, like with the other techniques, it takes a bit of regular practice for this one to be effective, but if you are able to be consistent with it, you can definitely see some improvements. But essentially what it asks you to do, and you can find guided versions of this, guys, if you look on YouTube or, like I say, on most meditation apps, things like that. But it asks you to kind of work through your muscle groups, tensing each muscle for about 5 seconds, trying to focus on what that feels like and, really focus on that, and then relaxing it afterwards and feeling how that, feels in your body. So it's quite like I say, it's quite a lengthy technique because you're going through each muscle group individually, but it's quite a helpful one actually, because not only are you releasing that tension, so you're getting that benefit, but also it does take a bit of concentration. So if you are really struggling with the worry, before falling asleep, for example, it can be really helpful just to take your mind off that as well. So it has, two sides to it there. And there is an app there mentioned, so Feeling Good app. On track 3 we'll talk you through that specific technique as well, but if you do Google it or put it into YouTube, you can find lots of different options for this one. And yeah, it has been shown to be really, really helpful, I suppose, with managing the more physical signs of stress. One thing to mention, like it says on the bottom there, if you do have any kind of back or muscle problems, definitely best to ask your GP for advice before you do it, or just don't tense that particular part of your body. So please do, seek the appropriate advice if you need to for this one. And the other final one I wanted to just go through briefly with you guys is just to cover diaphragm breathing. So I quite like covering this one just because you can do this anywhere essentially. And it's a very, very quick technique. It's just something that can really help to, calm that instant anxiety that you might be feeling if you are kind of feeling particularly stressed, overwhelmed in any situation. It can just be a nice technique to have, that you know how to do. You can do it for a few seconds, bring yourself back to the moment, and then try and move on. Because it's quite normal when we're feeling a bit anxious, a bit stressed, for our breathing to change. So just trying to get that focus back on it. So it's quite simple, like it says in the steps here. All you need to do is breathe in slowly through your nose for the count of 7, and then out through the mouth for the count of 11. So you can do that for a few minutes each day, trying to kind of relax yourself, trying to bring that breathing back down a little bit, really, and a bit slower, because often when we are stressed and anxious, it can kind of increase. So it can be a nice one just to keep in mind, I suppose. If you're out of the house, you could do it pretty much anywhere. and just really use it to help manage those physical symptoms. So I guess a couple of different techniques there. So with the progressive muscle relaxation, it's a technique that takes a little longer, I suppose. I think most of the guided versions are around 15 to 20 minutes. So you probably want to be at home, in a comfortable space, maybe laying in bed for that one. But with this one, it could be something that you just have to do, whenever you'd like to give it a go. So it's quite important that, we do have a few techniques like this that we can fall back on, because often, we can do everything we can to manage our behaviours and our worries, but we still might notice some physical feelings of stress, which can keep that cycle going. So just having a couple of techniques that we can use can be really helpful. So definitely 2 I'd recommend. You could also research grounding or refocusing techniques. There's lots of different kinds essentially that you can use. It's just about finding the one that works for you. But just anything essentially that tries to keep your mind off those worries and that stress, but also something that brings you back to the present moment, enables you just to have that little reset, can be really helpful when we're thinking about kind of relaxation and managing those symptoms as well. So I guess just in terms of the techniques that we've covered, I know we have covered quite a lot in a small amount of time there. So we've looked at obviously managing our worries, and we've looked at kind of managing our behaviour in terms of that avoidance and motivation. And then we've also looked at a few relaxation techniques. So like I mentioned, there's quite a lot more that we could go through in more detail, but as it's just an hour session, I don't want to overwhelm you guys. So obviously our service is here if you do want to get a little bit more information, or even just consider some support with us as well. But I suppose just before I do go through the final few slides, which are just more, I suppose, signposting bits, did anyone have any questions about what we've covered at the moment?
We've got some questions actually that are in the chat.
Okay.
There was one here, which actually I think is a question here, which I think actually you're going to lead on to next, which is around signposting.
Yes. Yeah.
Because Dave and I are the mental health first aid instructors for the trust. So there's a question from Dave that says, what could I say to the trust's mental health first aiders when they're approached by staff about financial stress? What signposting is there outside of the trust, as most people find it embarrassing or difficult to talk or acknowledge in their place of work, such as, he's put down a couple, the Citizens Advice Bureau, or, Martin Lewis site, etc., etc. And then I think, like I said, I think you're going to lead on to that actually, because just caught a sneaky peek at your next slide.
Yeah.
The next question was, I like the techniques as it's about self. How do we start or encourage wives, husbands or partners, etc., to share their anxiety about financial stress, as we know it does lead to a lot of relationship breakdowns? I suppose I'm thinking a bit like Relate for marriages, a safe space for couples to talk, etc.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's somewhere we would usually signpost to around Relate. But I suppose in terms of, opening up the conversation around finances, things like that, it might even just be that you start using these techniques first and just kind of exploring them for yourself, maybe talking about them a little bit more openly with your partner or whoever you live with. Yeah. You could even use something like behavioural activation to plan in that time, I suppose, almost like a little meeting to discuss your finances, go through what you want to cover. Problem solving can also be quite helpful for that as well, because often I think we just don't know how to approach our partner about certain financial issues or bring that up. So you could actually even use problem solving to think, what do I need to say? How's the best way to go about this? When should I do this? What outcome do I want? How might they react? It just gives you that, I guess, time and space to reflect on what you actually want from the conversation before you go into it, because I think sometimes we go in expecting one thing, we then don't get what we think, and then, like you say, it leads to arguments and things like that. So it might even just being a bit more kind of reflective in that sense before you head into the conversation, and then just trying to keep it collaborative, I suppose, like I say, trying to plan in that time and kind of involve each other in the things that you are doing, I suppose, as well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Also, I was just looking at your technique around diaphragm breathing, and this was something that I was talking to a group of student nurses about recently. We were talking about interview skills, and we were talking about how to manage that immediate anxiety in the moment when they're just about to go in for an interview. We talked about box breathing, using box breathing, but also diaphragm breathing. And then we had a little practice of diaphragm breathing as well, because I think one of the things that I notice about people is when they're trying to regulate their breathing, they're not thinking about their posture. Yes. And they kind of they're slumped like this and their shoulders are back. So, you know, we had a little practice of how do we open up our shoulders and open up our chest and diaphragm to allow for that breathing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's such a good point as well. You're absolutely right, because it definitely does make a difference, you know, your posture on when you're doing it. So it's definitely a good point to raise. And yeah, I guess it's just with these types of techniques, it's just about finding something that works for you. So you have got this one, but like I mentioned, there's also lots of grounding techniques that you can find. One of the most popular ones we talk about is the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. I don't know if anyone's come across that, but that just looks essentially at re-engaging you with your senses, you know, in the moment. And that's another one that you can do basically anywhere. So sometimes it's just good to have a few of these, isn't it, I suppose, that you can fall back on. Definitely. Thank you.
There is a couple of more questions in the chat, but you might want to carry on, finish your couple of slides, and then we'll come back to those.
Yeah, no problem. I'll go through the main places that we tend to signpost to, but I think you've already mentioned one or two of them, to be fair, Sasha. So we do, in terms of getting more practical advice and support, we would usually point people to CAB, so the Citizens Advice Bureau. So they do offer lots of advice, lots of cost of living advice. They do also have an online chat and a telephone helpline. So definitely, if you've got any questions, would recommend trying to reach out to them. We also use or signpost to, should I say, to community law, which I suppose are a bit more specialist advice, but they can also just offer general advice as well, and they're happy for people to contact them by telephone, email, or one-to-one as well. So that could be another option. I guess more in terms of debt, but they do also just offer general advice as well. We've got Step Change, so they tend to support with debt mainly, so they can help you with things like debt management plans and, you know, getting you, I guess, feeling a little bit more organised with all of that. But they do also cover other things like mortgage advice, and they've got repayment calculators on there, lots of information around benefits and just general cost of living tips as well. So usually that's what I would recommend in terms of the more practical signposting. But obviously, if anyone else has any that they tend to use, we can all put them in the chat. But that would be the more practical side of things, I guess, with that. And yeah, I think that's kind of the end of the slides that I've got. So yeah, if there are any more questions, I'm happy to go through them.
Okay. Has anybody got any questions before I just go through the last part of the chat? Yeah, Dave's got one.
Yep. Hi. Really good. I'm probably enjoyed that, and I do like the techniques. Yeah. The reason why I was asking about, sorry, I know it's not a lot about signposting here, but about signposting is because we do get people that come up to us as, you know, peer support, mental health first aiders, and this is happening. You know, I'm in a lot of trouble, or I can't afford this, or my kids are going to go without food, and you kind of go. And you look to the basics, go this way, and often it's things like Citizens Advice Bureau. And I know from my own experience many years ago, that's where I got told to go through military welfare, was go to Citizens Advice. And what they said was, well, we'll write off 80% of your debt. And I was like, oh, great. And it was like a massive relief. What I didn't realise, for the next 6 years, I couldn't get a penny. And that was worse. I'd rather have gone, how do I pay it all back, and not have that? So I think when people are coming and they're having this stress about finances, we must, insurers, leaders, as good managers, as whatever, that we explore more than just that signpost of go this way. Actually, what does that look like in a year, in two, in 3 years? Because I think that's important. That initial, oh God, I got rid of it, but actually
What is the cost?
there is an outcome of that. And I think, you know, then you're going back to, right, you better get your breathing right. Okay, that's great, but now what do I do for the next 6 years? So I was just asking, you know, how do we, as, you know, trusts, as managers, how are we going to start encouraging staff, managers, leaders, whatever you want to call them, to start having healthy conversations around financial stress? Because we know cost of living is now affecting everybody. And one thing I will finish on, sorry, one thing I did hear this and I did challenge it. We must put something in place because the lower banded people will be struggling. No, it doesn't matter where you are or what you've got, we can all have financial stress. So it's more of just that exploring. Yasmin, you know, if you've got any advice, happy for it to be posted on later, but it just feels like a minefield sometimes. But I've really enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a good point, David, isn't it? Because like you say, we all do need this support, and it's just about trying to speak more openly about it. And I think that's why a big reason why we wanted to run the session, to be honest, is just to make it more clear, I suppose, that it is completely normal. Like you mentioned, it doesn't really matter what band. I'm sure we're all feeling it in some way, in different ways. So it's just about normalising it, isn't it? I suppose, about being able to think about it. I mean, we do run webinars, financial stress webinars through our service. But we've also just got general stress, anxiety webinars. Obviously, if someone is within the trust, we can also lock their account, so it's completely confidential. So I would encourage people to reach out to us, even if they're feeling a little bit sceptical. It could even just be an initial chat at first, if that makes sense, because we do see a lot of people coming through with worry, anxiety, stress, and obviously with this cost of living crisis, there are definitely kind of support options that we have for that. So it's not that they'd be forced to attend a webinar or a group where their name would be, you know, obvious there. They could have one-to-one sessions. Like I say, it can be completely confidential. So I'd definitely be encouraging our service, even if they're a little bit skeptical at first. We can definitely provide some support. Like I say, there's lots of different options. We've even got online CBT that you can do independently. You just need to get in touch with us to request that. So there's lots of different things that we can think about. If you don't want to access the service, you know, on a one-to-one basis, that's not a problem. It might be that we just set you up for some online course or kind of signpost to a few other areas. I think I'm not sure exactly what sessions are running at the moment, but I know sometimes Mind or the Recovery College sometimes run some sessions as well, if they wanted to maybe not be, you know, within the trust, that kind of thing. So it might just be worth kind of discussing other signposting options with them as well. But yeah, thank you, David. It's a good point, definitely.
No, thanks very much. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to point out that the Recovery College do have a section on the marketplace on the Virtual Wellbeing Festival, if anybody wanted a bit more information on what the Recovery College offer.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Louise.
There's another question in the chat that says, should we be encouraging people to stay away from social media when they have financial stress?
I think it's an interesting point, isn't it? I suppose it comes back a bit similar to I think what Dawn was mentioning in terms of, you know, that avoidance. I think it really depends on the person. So if you are really finding that it's adding to the stress in quite a negative way, it might be that you want to perhaps put a bit of a limit on it. You know, you could kind of use some of these techniques to think about, how can I reduce my time on social media, thinking about who we follow and what types of things we're actually engaging with in on social media as well. But I think it's an important point, because, you know, often with these worries and negative thoughts, we don't really even have to go out the house now to see, you know, other people doing different things, maybe going on holidays, you know, buying all these things. So it can definitely impact our mental health. So I think it's thinking about it for yourself, but you may want to reduce the time on social media, or it might be that you're just kind of noticing your thoughts a little bit more as you're going through the social media. So is there anything that you can challenge in there? You know, are you having any particular negative thoughts that perhaps aren't 100% true? And just trying to look at it from that angle, because I'm sure for a lot of us, we wouldn't necessarily just delete all our social media. But I suppose it's just about trying to take a bit of control back. Maybe are there some accounts you don't want to follow anymore, or certain things that you don't want to look at? just, yeah, like I say, just trying to challenge those thoughts around social media, because often what you see on there, it's, as I'm sure we all know, it's not usually 100% real, is it? But
no,
yeah, it's an interesting point.
An interesting thing is that, I don't know about you, but whenever you Google something that you're looking for, maybe it's an item that you want to know how much it is or something like that, and then all of a sudden it's all over your Facebook page and your Instagram. And I mean, only the other day I was looking at something in Zip World in Wales, and now it's all over my social media. And it's, you know, so it's always, there's reminders there to spend money all the time.
Of course.
And if you are, let's say, if you are an impulsive spender, and actually that is a root cause of, you know, could be a root cause of your overspending or your debt, is that you actually find those things difficult to I suppose to have that control around. You know, and being on social media, and it does always, there's always reminders there, isn't there? There's always things coming up to say, or adverts to tempt us, isn't there, to spend money.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's where I think it's more on a case by case basis. If you know that's something that you're going to struggle with, it might be about trying to reduce that time, you know, maybe planning in some other things that you can do instead of scrolling through social media, because I know for a lot of us it's just a bit of a natural thing to do. But you could use even that behavioural activation to think about what other activities could I actually put in this evening, for example, to reduce how much time I'm actually going to spend on the apps. And maybe even just reflecting at the end, you know, did that help my mental health? What's good about that? You know, just actually being able to, I guess, test it out a little bit, because for a lot of us, like I say, we do spend a lot of time on there, and it's so easy to get sucked in, isn't it? Definitely.
Okay, just checking out the chat. So I don't think there are any other questions in there, just a few comments. Dawn's put, I would encourage people to go and talk to their banks or building societies if they're worried about debt, but also I think sometimes it's helpful to go and talk to you know, the organizations that maybe that you owe money to, that you're worried about.
Of course.
Because I think there's a lot more support being put in place now, isn't there, for people, especially if they're worried about money. There's more that all these organizations are doing.
Absolutely. And it's all like you say, you don't know until you ask, I suppose. So yeah, it's definitely worth just to kind of have those conversations, isn't it, to try and figure out what to do. And then once you know your options, you can then sit down and try to figure out a plan, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the chat, there's just some links now in there for things like the Recovery College, and also Mind are in there as well now. So if anybody wants to access any of that, they can. But I'm going to hand you back, I think, to Dawn now.
Perfect.
Thank you. And you know, and it was a really great session, and listening throughout the session, a lot of it can be applied not just to financial anxiety, but lots of other types of anxiety. And it's always an interesting conversation when we think about what we see on social media. I always remember somebody telling me it's their highlight reel, and just because they look like they've got a lot doesn't mean they've got a lot. It may be that they're also worrying about finances in the background, so it's important to think about those things. But interestingly, you've got a great screen up there. I am going to share my screen in a second, but I'm going to use yours, because if you have been affected by any of the information or experiences that have been discussed during this session, please feel free to reach out and seek support or advice. And the following support options underneath are where you can discuss, you know, some of those things. I know, Yasmin, you've talked about contacting you as well.
Yeah. Also, sorry, Dawn, just to kind of add to this slide, if you do just find our website, you can easily find us through Google. If you don't want to call in, that's absolutely fine. Like I mentioned, we do have a self-referral form on the website, and you can go straight through to online CBT. So it doesn't always have to be that you have to speak to anyone. So just to mention that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yasmin. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, just in terms of providing some feedback, because feedback is a gift, as I hope you all know. So when we think about feedback, you've got a couple of QR codes here. One is for the feedback, so please feel free to hop onto that QR code and just share your thoughts around the session and any other sessions that you've been part of. And then the QR code on the right-hand side, which I know Louise is popping into the chat box as well, you can find more activities and resources to support your wellbeing and book on to any other sessions that you fancy as well. And please share the information with your colleagues. Get social. So when we think about sharing all of the knowledge that we've obtained, anything that we've really enjoyed, please share it using the hashtag, get my words out, VWBF23. And yes, so get on there and start sharing if that's what you like to do. Again, we've talked through this, but this is if you have been affected by any of that information that you've heard today. And I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining the session. Thank you so much, Yasmin, for running the session, and to all of our health and social care colleagues across Northamptonshire, thank you for everything you do. Have a fantastic rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.